Johannes Brahms wrote that in 1896. He was 63 years old. He had just learned that Clara Schumann, the woman he had loved in one form or another for over 40 years, was dying. He wrote 11 chorale preludes in the last months of his life. He never heard any of them performed. He never published them. He put them in a drawer. When he died the following year, they found them there. Welcome back to Pull All the Stops. I'm Jillian Gardner. Today we are talking about Johannes Brahms and about what a man writes when he knows he is running out of time. Johannes Brahms was born in 1833 in Hamburg, Germany, the son of a double bass player who played in dance halls and taverns to support his family. The neighborhood was rough, the money was scarce, but there was music in the house from the beginning, and Brahms was at the piano almost before he could reach the keys. He was a prodigy, not the pampered conservatory kid, but the working kind. He played piano in the taverns and dance halls of Hamburg's waterfront district as a teenager to help support his family. He later said very little about those years. What he did say suggested they left marks he never entirely lost. A certain wariness, a self-sufficiency, a tendency to keep people at arm's length when he cared for them deeply. In 1853, when Brahms was 20 years old, he met Robert Schumann. Schumann was one of the dominant figures of German musical life, composer, critic, champion of new music, and Schumann, after hearing the young Brahms play and reading his early compositions, did something remarkable. He wrote a famous essay in the Music Journal introducing Brahms to the world as, and I am paraphrasing, but barely, the new messiah of German music, the heir to Beethoven, the future of art form. That is an extraordinary thing to say about a 20-year-old. It is also an extraordinary burden to place on one. Brahms spent the rest of his life either living up to that introduction or wrestling with it. He was 43 years old before he completed his first symphony, having worked on it for over 20 years, setting it aside, returning to it, afraid to release it into a world that had been told to expect a masterpiece. When it was finally performed, the conductor Hans von Bülow called it Beethoven's 10th. Brahms was not pleased by the comparison. He never was. When Brahms met Robert Schumann in 1853, he also met Robert's wife, Clara. Clara Schumann was one of the greatest pianists of the 19th century. She was also a composer of real distinction, though the world was slow to recognize it. She was 14 years older than Brahms. She was married. She had eventually 8 children. She was, by every account, a woman of extraordinary intelligence, beauty, and force of character. Brahms fell in love with her almost immediately. Whether she loved him in return in the same way, at the same depth, is something scholars have debated for over a century. What is not debated is that they were deeply, lastingly, intimately connected for the rest of their lives. Robert Schumann suffered a mental breakdown in 1854 and spent the last 2 years of his life in an asylum. During that period, Brahms moved into the Schumann household to help Clara manage the children and the household. He was 20 years old. He stayed. Robert Schumann died in 1856. Brahms did not marry Clara. He never married anyone. The reasons are not entirely clear. Perhaps he felt that marrying her would betray his loyalty to Robert, whom he had loved and admired. Perhaps Clara herself kept the relationship at a careful distance. Perhaps Brahms, with his Hamburg wariness and his habit of pushing people away precisely when he needed them most, simply could not cross the threshold. He wrote her letters for 40 years. He revised them before sending, carefully, sometimes obsessively, and asked her to destroy them. She kept them anyway. He dedicated music to her. He sought her opinion on almost everything he composed. He was, in whatever way was available to him, faithful to her for the rest of his life. And when she died in May of 1896, having outlived her husband by 40 years, having given her entire life to music and to the legacy of Robert Schumann, Brahms traveled to her funeral in Frankfurt and caught a cold, standing at her graveside in the rain. He was already ill. The cold made everything worse. He died 11 months later. He was 63 years old. The doctors said it was liver cancer, but people who knew him said that when Clara died, something essential in Brahms went with her. Now, Brahms and the organ, because this is Pull All the Stops, and we need to talk about what this man actually did with the instrument. Brahms was not primarily an organ composer. He wrote 2 symphonies, 4 concertos, a German requiem, 2 piano concertos, enormous amounts of chamber music and piano music and song. The organ was not the center of his output, but it was never far from his thinking. The reason is Bach. Brahms was one of the great Bach scholars of the 19th century at a time when Bach scholarship was still a relatively new enterprise, when large portions of the Bach catalog were only just being recovered, edited, and published. Brahms studied Bach's organ works with intense seriousness. He transcribed Bach. He edited Bach. He absorbed Bach in a way that very few composers of his generation did. And the organ, for Brahms, was inseparable from Bach. From Lutheran chorale, from the German Protestant tradition that ran like a spine through the music he loved most. When Brahms sat at an organ, he was not thinking about the French symphonic tradition, about Franck or Vierne and their orchestral ambitions. He was thinking about counterpoint, about the way Bach's voice moved, about the chorale tune as a kind of cantus firmus, a fixed melody above which everything else was built. His early organ works, the Prelude and Fugue in A minor and the two Preludes and Fugues published posthumously, are exactly what you would expect from a young man steeped in Bach, rigorous, contrapuntally demanding, somewhat austere. They are exercises in a language he was learning, the language of Bach, and they show a formidable intelligence at work. But it is the late chorale preludes, the 11 pieces of Opus 122, written in the last months of his life, that show Brahms doing something that could only have come from him, something that Bach could not have written, even though every note is grounded in Bach's tradition. Because Bach wrote from a place of theological certainty. Bach's organ music is luminous in faith, with the absolute, untroubled conviction that God is present and the music is an act of worship. Brahms was not that kind of believer. He was a man of deep religious feeling that was also profoundly uncertain. He knew the tradition. He loved the chorales. He had set the German Requiem, one of the most searching sacred works of the 19th century, to texts he chose himself from the Lutheran Bible. But the certainty that animates Bach is not what you hear in Opus 122. What you hear is something more like longing, like a man reaching towards something he cannot quite grasp. The 11 chorale preludes, Opus 122, were composed in the summer of 1896, between Clara's death in May and Brahms' own death in April of 1897. They were published posthumously. He never heard any of them performed. He put them in a drawer and left them there. There are 11 pieces, each based on a Lutheran chorale tune. They range in character from the gently tender to the starkly penitential. Together they feel less like a collection of organ pieces and more like a spiritual autobiography, a man in his last year looking back, reckoning with what he believed and what he was not sure of and what he hoped. The chorale tunes he chose are telling. Several of them are associated with death and farewell. O World, I Must Leave Thee appears twice at the very end of the set, as if Brahms knew it was the last thing he would write. Lo, how a rose are blooming, as a Christmas chorale, tender, intimate, stripped of all ornamentation. Herzliebster Jesu is a melody associated in the Lutheran tradition with both longing and farewell. And then there is number 2, Herzliebster Jesu, Dearest Jesus, What Law Hast Thou Broken? A Passion Chorale, a Good Friday text, a melody associated with suffering, with penitence, with the question at the center of Christian life, why did this happen and what does it mean that it did? Brahms chose that. In the last year of his life, having just lost the woman he loved, he sat down at a desk somewhere in Vienna and chose a passion chorale about suffering and wrote a piece that is, by any measure, one of the most searching and honest things he ever put on paper. Herzliebster Jesu, chorale prelude number 2 from Opus 122, is a short piece. It runs perhaps 3 to 4 minutes. It is not technically demanding in the way the symphonies or the concertos are demanding. It does not ask for virtuosity. What it asks for is something harder. It asks for stillness, for patience, for a willingness to let the music be exactly as spare and searching as Brahms wrote it, without adding warmth that isn't there, without softening what was meant to be stark. The chorale tune, Herzliebster Jesu, is stated in long notes in the upper voice, the way Bach would state a chorale cantus firmus. But underneath it, Brahms does something characteristically his own. The inner voice moves in a slow, chromatic, suspended way, half steps and unexpected harmonic turns, that create a sense of unresolved longing. The harmony never quite settles. It keeps reaching, moving sideways, finding a momentary resting place before pressing on. It is the sound of a man who knows the tradition, who loves the tradition, and who is being completely honest about where he actually is inside it, not at rest, still searching. Here it is, written in 1896 by a man who put it in a drawer and never heard it played. If that piece opened something, here is where to go next. Opus 122, number 11, O Welt, ich muss dich lassen, is the last piece Brahms ever wrote. O world, I must leave thee. He wrote it twice in the set, once in the middle, once at the very end. The second version is slower and more sparse than the first. It is among the most quietly devastating things in all of music. Do not listen to it alone if you can help it. Opus 122, number 8, Es ist ein Ros, es sprühen, lo how a rose blooming, is the gentlest piece in the set. Where Herzliebster Jesu is searching and stark, Es ist ein Ros is tender and luminous. It is Brahms at his most unguarded. It sounds like a lullaby and a farewell simultaneously. And if you want Brahms at full scale, find the German Requiem Opus 45. It is not an organ work. It is for choir, soloists, and orchestra, but it is the same spiritual world as Opus 122, rendered at enormous size. It begins with Blessed are they that mourn, and ends with Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord. It was written over many years, with parts completed after the deaths of his mother and of Robert Schumann. It is the most personal large-scale work he ever wrote, and it will give you everything Opus 122 is doing in miniature, expanded to a full hour of music. Johannes Brahms, born in Hamburg, tavern country. Fell in love with a married woman and stayed faithful to her for 40 years, wrote a German Requiem in his 30s, wrote 11 chorale preludes in his 60s and put them in a drawer, died 11 months after Clara in the spring of 1897 of liver cancer in Vienna. He was not always easy to be around. By most accounts, he was frequently gruff, occasionally cruel with his words, and constitutionally unable to accept the comfort he so desperately needed from the people who loved him. But what he wrote. Friday on Pull All the Stops, Hymn of the Week, we are looking at Praise to the Lord the Almighty, a 17th century German hymn by Joachim Neander, set to one of the most jubilant tunes in the entire hymnal. After Brahms, we could all use something jubilant. I promise it delivers. Subscribe so you don't miss it. New videos every Tuesday and Friday. And leave me a comment. Had you heard any of Brahms' organ music before today? And what do you make of a man who wrote music in the last year of his life and put it in a drawer, never intending anyone to hear it? I want to know what you think about that. I'm Jillian Gardner. This is Pull All the Stops. See you Friday.